This is a gruesome South Korean film that leaves every single woman who watches it with a shiver down her spine. It also serves as a reminder that evil individuals might be lurking right around us. The protagonist is a middle-aged man named Mr. Choi. He specifically targets attractive single women and ensures that there are no witnesses to his crimes, allowing him to evade capture. Each time Mr. Choi commits his heinous acts, he proceeds to rape his victims before subjecting them to cruel dismemberment and murder. His habit of dismembering the bodies makes it nearly impossible for the police to find any leads. Ironically, he is a respected school bus driver who wears a benevolent expression while transporting students. However, when evening falls, he prowls the streets in his vehicle, seeking out vulnerable women walking alone. On a particular night, Mr. Choi's attention is drawn to a beautiful female driver whose car has a flat tire, and she waits for assistance. Upon seeing this woman, his desires surge uncontrollably. He devises a pretext of helping her fix the car. But her vigilance proves formidable. She refuses to open her car door. Overwhelmed by his desires, Mr. Choi shatters the car window in an attempt to get to her. This sudden act terrifies the woman. She attempts to escape from the passenger side, but a nearby fence obstructs the car door. Mr. Choi forcefully opens the door, subdues her, and knocks her unconscious. Dragging her from the vehicle, he starts his journey home, unaware of the calamity he's bringing upon himself. After subjecting the woman to unspeakable torment, she is left severely mutilated. Eventually, she regains consciousness, pleading with Mr. Choi to spare her life because she is pregnant. However, for Mr. Choi, there's no distinction between killing one person or two. He's meticulously selecting his next victim, preparing to dispose of her in the same gruesome manner. The details of this process are too disturbing for most people to bear. Remember the wedding ring that got washed away? It marks the beginning of Mr. Choi's nightmare. After each gruesome act, he takes great care to groom himself, admiring his handsome appearance in the mirror. A few days later, a child playing by the river stumbled upon a woman's ear unintentionally, which frightened the child. As night fell, a large contingent of police officers arrived here for a search. With the discovery of the woman's upper body, all the police officers at the scene gathered around. Among them was the woman's father, a retired military man. He, a retired soldier, stood there, gazing at his daughter's disfigured body, unsure of what to do. At that moment, the woman's husband also arrived at the scene. His name was Ah Wei, a special agent. Seeing his wife's mutilated body, it ignited an immediate desire within him to kill the culprit. This was because his wife had just been confirmed to be pregnant before she was ruthlessly murdered. According to South Korean law, even if the culprit were caught, they could only be sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed like this scoundrel was getting off easily. So, he decided to take matters into his own hands and seek vengeance for his wife. Afterward, Mr. Choi continued driving his school bus around, searching for solitary women. This time, his target was a girl who had missed the last bus. Mr. Choi transformed into a benevolent uncle and offered to take the girl home. Although the girl felt somewhat uneasy, it was challenging to find a taxi in this remote area. Furthermore, upon seeing that Mr. Choi was driving a school bus, she lowered her guard. Before long, the car arrived at a secluded side road. Mr. Choi immediately pulled out a steel pipe and ferociously struck at the girl, then took her back to his residence. A few minutes later, Mr. Choi brutally killed her with a sickle. After weeks of investigation, Ah Wei finally narrowed down his target to Mr. Choi. After thorough searching, Ah Wei managed to locate Mr. Choi's home address. The next day, Ah Wei arrived at Mr. Choi's house, coincidentally finding him absent. The place was a rundown house halfway up a hill, in an extremely remote location. The simple and worn-out rooms were surprisingly clean and tidy, hardly resembling the dwelling of a murderer. However, Ah Wei noticed something peculiar. Every cabinet was secured with 3 locks. Prying them open, he was shocked to find women's belongings inside, evidence enough of Mr. Choi's deviant nature. Continuing his search, Ah Wei stumbled upon a pool of blood in a back room. An engagement ring in the drain, not yet washed away, confirmed that Mr. Choi was his wife's killer. Fueled by rage, Wei vowed to make the culprit pay 100-fold. Unaware of these developments, Mr. Choi was busy chauffeuring students home. One girl at the back of the bus was still asleep. With a lecherous grin, Mr. Choi bound and dumped her into a pit. As he leered at the girl's fair and tender legs, faint footsteps from outside caught his attention. Immediately sensing something amiss, he grabbed a sickle and rushed to the door. Seeing only one person outside, Mr. Choi smirked and lunged forward with the sickle. Yet, Wei, a trained special agent, swiftly subdued him with a few moves. Realizing he was overpowered, Mr. Choi attempted to flee. But Wei skillfully disarmed him with a bamboo pole and a swift kick. Wei grabbed a plastic bag and placed it over Mr. Choi's head. Within a minute, Mr. Choi lost consciousness. Wei then lifted a large stone, poised to end Mr. Choi's life, but he hesitated. His plan was to make Mr. Choi suffer, not die instantly. Wei inserted a tracker into Mr. Choi's mouth and stomped on his arm, breaking it. Upon awakening, Mr. Choi discovered his wrist broken and cash left beside him. Perplexed, he wondered what kind of person could be more malicious than himself. Regardless, he had managed to preserve his life. Urgently needing medical attention for his broken arm, Mr. Choi's subsequent movements were closely monitored by Wei. Mr. Choi intended to hail a taxi to the hospital, but instead he ran into two individuals who had plans to abduct him. One had a wicked smile plastered across his face, while the other had a fierce and menacing expression. Mr. Choi swiftly sensed that something was off. He glanced at the driver's photo on the dashboard and found it amusing that he had encountered individuals of his kind. Displaying his recent wounds from a beating, Mr. Choi used them as a warning to these two individuals. However, the ones behind them were already poised for action. Faced with no other option, Mr. Choi decided to take the initiative. Within no time, he effortlessly took care of these two deviants. After eliminating them, Mr. Choi popped open the trunk, revealing a messenger bag and a set of sportswear. Changing into the sportswear instantly rejuvenated him. The following day, Mr. Choi arrived at a clinic to have his arm examined. There, he encountered a petite nurse with delicate features and chubby cheeks. She unintentionally sparked Mr. Choi's desires. As he was leaving, Mr. Choi directly flirted with the nurse, leaving her feeling bashful. The recent encounter had left the nurse quite frightened. Seeking solace, she headed to the pharmacy. Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Choi had been waiting there for quite some time. Suddenly, Mr. Choi locked the door, switched off the lights, and commanded the nurse to undress. Cornered, the nurse reluctantly complied, removing her clothes. Just as Mr. Choi was indulging in his sordid pleasure, Wei walked in. Without uttering a word, he swung a fire extinguisher at Mr. Choi's head. Caught off guard, Mr. Choi was left dumbfounded. Why was it that no matter where he went, he always seemed to encounter this person? Mr. Choi, however, understood that he was no match for him. At this moment, Mr. Choi found himself unable to win a fight and unable to escape. The fear Mr. Choi was feeling was exactly what Wei wanted to witness. Wei's actions thoroughly terrified Mr. Choi. All of a sudden, Wei thrust a knife, piercing Mr. Choi's ankle and severing his Achilles tendon. Thus, Mr. Choi was once again spared. This feeling of being toyed with like a monkey left Mr. Choi completely agitated. At this point, he felt the need to strike back against Wei. Mr. Choi suspected that his vehicle might have been fitted with a tracking device. His plan was to kill a driver and steal a car. He positioned himself on the roadside, preparing to intercept and hijack a car, when he unexpectedly ran into South Korea's special forces. Even Mr. Choi had a compassionate side and decided to spare them. He realized that dealing with Wei single-handedly was impossible. Consequently, he thought of his former partner, Tong Zai. Tong Zai was doing much better than Mr. Choi, owning a grand mansion and a remarkably beautiful girlfriend. Soon enough, Tong Zai emerged from the basement with a woman. Just as he was about to dismember her, Wei appeared again. Wei grabbed Tong Zai's hand and forcefully snapped it. Tong Zai's cries caught the attention of Mr. Choi downstairs. Upon locking eyes with Wei, Mr. Choi opened fire. Ah Wei swiftly scrambled upstairs. Upon reaching the upper floor, Tong Zai's girlfriend attempted to ambush Ah Wei but was swiftly knocked unconscious by him. In the meantime, Tong Zai regained consciousness and lunged at Ah Wei, but Ah Wei flipped him over and grabbed an iron rod, striking at Tong Zai's head until he noticed Mr. Choi's presence and halted. Ah Wei then casually picked up a fishing hook and tossed it on the ground. Mr. Choi charged straight at Ah Wei, unknowingly stepping on the hook. Witnessing this, Ah Wei rushed over, driven by the frustration in his heart, and continued to fight against Mr. Choi. Once Ah Wei had calmed down, he decided to spare Mr. Choi's life and even took him to the hospital. However, at the hospital, a colleague informed Ah Wei about the tracking capsule inside Mr. Choi's belly during a conversation, not realizing they were being overheard. This revelation handed control of the situation back to Mr. Choi. Mr. Choi formally declared war against Ah Wei and even deduced that Ah Wei was the husband of the pregnant woman. Mr. Choi bought a whole bottle of laxatives from a pharmacy. Coincidentally, an unlucky taxi driver was using the restroom at that time. Thus, he grabbed a baseball bat and gave the driver a beating, releasing his pent-up anger and stealing the taxi. He also planted a tracker he had just removed into the driver's mouth. When Ah Wei arrived following the signal, Mr. Choi had already left. Mr. Choi's focus shifted onto Ah Wei's father-in-law this time, and before long, this stubborn old man was left half-dead from the beating. Just as Mr. Choi was preparing to send him off, a commotion outside the door caught their attention. It turned out to be Ah Wei's younger sister returning home. Upon Ah Wei's hurried return, the vicinity of their home was already surrounded by the police. Although the father-in-law managed to survive, the younger sister had been tortured to death. Crafty as ever, Mr. Choi chose to turn himself in, convinced that under South Korean law, he wouldn't face the death penalty. He smugly believed he would continue living. Ah Wei, behind the wheel of a car, abruptly threw Mr. Choi inside with a forceful brake and sped through the police cordon. The scene shifted. Now, Mr. Choi found himself on the executioner's block in his own home. He beheld the very tools he had used to kill those girls. Nevertheless, Mr. Choi remained defiant, taunting Ah Wei incessantly. Uninterested in his words, Wei plunged a screwdriver into Mr. Choi's face. However, that wasn't enough for Ah Wei. He wanted to kill Mr. Choi at the moment of his greatest agony and fear, in order to achieve the effect he desired. It was only at this juncture that Mr. Choi truly comprehended the terror he had once inflicted. Ah Wei secured a noose at the other end of the guillotine string and placed it in Mr. Choi's mouth. When the door was opened, the guillotine would fall. Ah Wei alerted Mr. Choi's family to the scene. As the door was pulled open forcefully by Mr. Choi's father, the guillotine blade descended without a hitch. And with that, Wei departed. This is the ending. Wei's journey to avenge, to punish the demon, led him to become one himself. Ah Wei wasn't certain whether his actions were right or wrong, but the heavy burden on his heart had finally lifted. Only now, at this very moment, did Ah Wei begin to feel the weight of his actions. May every kind-hearted person never encounter the demon that turns them into a devil.